Church, please have your Bibles with you. We'll be going through Acts 25 today. We'll go through the entire chapter of Acts 25. We'll look at all 27 verses today. But if you could, I'll read, and please, the verses will be up on the screen. Acts chapter 25. I'll be reading from the English Standard Version. A very important passage, and once again we went through the entirety of Acts 24 last week because it's one piece that comes together. That's what I believe, how best to interpret it. Also here in Acts 25 we'll do the same, but I want you to pay close attention to the words that Luke is writing here. Of course, it seems like we've been going through all these trials regarding Paul. And he just keeps getting moved around from place to place, being hurt by different kinds of people of authority and so forth. And it almost feels like, like Luke is just repeating himself over and over again. But we must keep in mind that Luke, the words in which he is written is of course inspired by God. And there is of course no word of scripture that of course God gives to us that isn't useful for our walk. And of course, to inform us and empower us and sanctify us to glorify God. So pay close attention to Luke's words as he writes and records this incident. Acts 25, the word of God reads, "Now 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So, said he, let the men of authority among you go down with me, and if there is anything wrong about the men, let them bring charges against him. After he stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. Paul argued in his defense, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? But Paul said, I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. Now when some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. And as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there's a man left prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders and the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face and had an opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. So when they came together, here I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. When the accusers stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I supposed. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, you will hear him. So on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, and they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. Then at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man about whom the whole Jewish people petitioned me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had done nothing deserving death. And as he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him. But I have nothing definite to write to my lord about him. Therefore I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable in sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Indeed, the passage seems, of course, just another historical record, but I think there's some amazing truths to which we can uncover in this section as we go through it together. But once again, a recap of what we covered. We only covered 3 points in our last section on chapter 24. And if you recall, last week's sermon was called Living Blamelessly for Christ. And 3 important truths to which we covered was, first of all, that being Christian is about living blamelessly before God and people. We see here also in this story, in what we've read here in chapter 25, is that Paul once again repeats the fact that he has lived both blamelessly before God as well as before the law. We see here in this case. And so it teaches us once again that as Christians, that being faithful towards Christ doesn't necessarily mean you have to break the law of the world, as we see here. And so instead, we must demonstrate faithfulness both as Christians and also as citizens. And we'll see why that is also important in this case and what it demonstrates in light of our passage. But the second thing that we also learned was that trials and opposition strengthen Christian loyalty and courage. We saw that Paul responds to serious accusations regarding his character and his commitment to Christ in a cheerful and confident way. And if you recall, over the past 2 weeks, we've been emphasizing this point that when it comes to being a faithful Christian, it doesn't mean that we are to be passive, but we are to be courageous, as we see demonstrated here in the case of Paul. We are not to be fearful, and this is especially because we know who we stand with. Trials and tests strengthen faith, and they produce steadfastness, is what we also covered last week. And it reminds believers that their joy and strength doesn't come from the authority or those who agree with us, but comes ultimately from the authority under which we stand, and that is, of course, Christ. The third thing that we covered last week, towards the end of chapter 24, is to recognize that earthly power is temporary, but God's judgment is eternal. This is another important truth that was uncovered last week when we see, of course, that Paul reminds everyone who is looking and assessing his situation that his judgment, that God's judgment will, of course, be enacted upon those who are against him and those who are with him. As the Bible teaches us, there's a resurrection to come. A resurrection unto life for those who believe, but a resurrection unto judgment for those who are, of course, against God. And so we learned from that particular point that Paul reminds us that although we may not receive an honest and faithful judgment this side of heaven, will, of course, God will ultimately enact his justice sooner or later. And we saw, as we read the last section, verses 24 to 27 of chapter 24, we saw that after some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. In other words, we saw that Paul was sharing the gospel, sharing the truth about Jesus to these people of power. And verse 25 says, and he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the coming judgment. And once again, we see that even for those in power, they do not escape the need for the gospel. We see that Paul is neither intimidated by these people in power, and he recognizes that he has been commissioned by the most powerful of all to share this gospel truth. But we see here that what happens is that Felix is alarmed by this. He's made uncomfortable. And this is the reality that we must come to accept as people who proclaim the gospel, that the idea of sharing the gospel, the intention isn't to make them feel comfortable. It's to wake them up to the realization of God's wrath, God's judgment against sin, And it's only until then can they truly grasp the message of what it means to be saved by Christ. And so Felix, as we can see here, on the other hand, despite having heard the gospel, despite having been reasoned with for over 2 years, he continues to harden his heart against the truth of the word. And instead, we see here that he wants to be bribed. He's hoping that Paul would in fact give him money. In other words, be bribed by Paul. And we'll see that significance also in this text that we're studying in chapter 25. But we see at the end in verse 27 that when 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. That's where we left off. We see that even after 2 years, and as we also covered last week, that this man, this governor Felix, wasn't actually a nice man. We talked about that also. And while this lawyer Tertullus had said that, they had agreed, the Jews had agreed with his decrees and his laws and so forth, the reality is that we see towards the end of chapter 24 that Felix is actually removed from being the governor of Judea because he essentially had become unpopular. And that's why you can see at the end he says, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, he left Paul in prison. See, as governor, one of the major priorities was priorities in Judea was for you to quell any uprising that would come from the Jewish people. See, the Jews and the Romans aren't friends. The Jews and the Romans are actually at each other's throats, but at the same time, although the Romans are ruling over the Jews, in order to ensure that there is no uprising or to control them, your duty as the governor was, of course, to, in a sense, satisfy some of their needs such that they do not cause trouble. This is why it says, in order to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. But now we see that Porcius Festus comes into that same picture, and he doesn't do much different. But in the grander scheme and context of what's going on, we've seen these many trials that Paul is taking place. We've seen the Jewish authorities, we see the government authorities, and we see Paul in the middle of this. And it's important to understand that we as Christians, we must acknowledge that there's these various powers or spheres of sovereignty in technical terms that are in the world, for instance. And what that means is that we find, of course, that the church, the state, and the family are these sovereignties or these spheres in which God enacts his sovereignty. And we've seen in this text how these two spheres are essentially coming into contact with each other. See, the rulers we have met so far have cast their eyes on Paul's situation and have rightly pointed out many times that this conflict between Paul and the Jews, this is a religious issue. We don't want to get involved. And so we see here that an example of when the state, when it comes to matters of the church, it is best that the matters of the church be dealt on its own. And so we can see here in this case, however, that the state has to get involved. And why does the state have to get involved? Well, it's because Paul is a Roman citizen. So Paul is here at the intersection of these powers that we see here. And the question that we must ask ourselves, in light of this, what is the proper way to conduct ourselves? See, an example that you would like that we can consider even in our day and age is, of course, what happened in the COVID-19 pandemic, when, of course, the government had given regulations with regards to vaccinations and so forth, but the government in many ways had overstepped its boundaries with regards to worship in the church, whereby churches must be closed to the worship of God for the sake of government rule. And of course, many churches unfortunately had compromised on the commandments of God with regards to worship for the sake of satisfying the powers of this world. And so we see here in this text that this power of the world and this power of the church, unfortunately, are at this crossroads where they now have to come to a decision. What is the right course of action in this case? Like I said, Paul is essentially where the church and the state intersect. And the question that comes to mind, what is right and what is just? We all, even as Christians today, we stand at this crossroad. How should we respond when these two spheres intersect and come in conflict and we're smack in the middle of it? See, for the Jews, Paul must be killed. For the rulers, Paul is innocent. But to keep the Jews at bay, the powers must consider what would happen if they stir up the Jews by not killing Paul. This is the kind of dilemma that is going on in our story. While both have their agenda, neither side is considering what does God command. But you see, the separation of powers between these spheres are important. However, we must keep in mind that God is sovereign over all. We know this because Paul has showed us earlier, when he talked about judgment, that whether you die as a Jew or you die as a Roman, you will be judged. In other words, God cares not just how we manage the church, but also how we manage the world. God's authority is not just in the church, but also in the world. And like I said, neither of this side is stopping to think about what exactly does God command. And so the simple truth that we see here is ultimately when the world is godless, in the church or in the world, only conflict and trouble ensues. And we'll talk more about this in this text today, but we must keep in mind that also in Romans 13, it teaches us that God, in fact, in His sovereignty, allows and appoints the rulers that we have today. And at the same time, we see in the New Testament, in the Gospels, that Christ wasn't a person that didn't pay his taxes. In fact, Christ paid his taxes. And you read many times in the Gospel whereby Christ also says, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and render to God what is God's. So Christ himself was also an upstanding citizen. But what we must keep in mind is that God cares not just how we manage our church, but also how we manage the world. God's authority matters. And we find that in this predicament, those powers that are making all the wrong decisions are all wrong because they never consider what God says. And they do not know God. We essentially see this disorder and injustice. And it's a principle that we must keep in mind as we're reading this text. But also we must keep in mind that this is not just a book that matters only to everyday citizens. It matters also to kings. It matters to also people in power. When you read the gospel, you find, of course, that the scriptures, it talks about farmers, it talks about prophets, it talks about priests, it talks about kings, it talks about tax collectors. And the reason why I'm saying this is because, unfortunately, even in today's world, you find, of course, that Christians within the church, the problem is this: they're only as Christian as far as their church door. In other words, when I'm doing my when I'm doing my work in the world, God's authority does not bear anything on that. How I conduct myself in my office, how I conduct myself at home, God has no bearing on that. But when I come to church, that's when God matters. This is the problem that we must come to realize, that in this case, we see that Paul, on the other hand, does not conduct his life in a way that compartmentalizes his faith. He is just as much a Christian in the church as he is in the world. He's in the world, but not of the world, as we see in the New Testament. It teaches us not just how to consider how to be faithful with little also. It also teaches us, the Bible teaches us also how to be faithful with much. How to be faithful in persecution, but also how to be faithful with power and prestige. Not how to just be faithful as a religious person, but also as a people who live in the world that is also under God. As I've covered, Paul is a faithful Christian and a faithful citizen as well. The Jews and the Romans, on the other hand, are neither of these things. And we have seen extensively in the Gospel and in Acts how the Jews have also demonstrated so much ungodliness. These people who even have the scriptures are not acting as though God exists. Not acting as though God has not commanded much of what Paul has already talked to them about. But at the same time, we see that even these trials that we've been reading about over and over again in the last few chapters of the book of Acts is to reveal to us that those in power in the world aren't any different. That godlessness in the world is just as destructive. But we will explore this more closer in this chapter with clear application to our own lives. And so when we're looking at these people of power, These people of authority, we must keep in mind that these people, in our sense, in our modern terms, are politicians, people in power. Yeah. And for many people in our day and age, you may think that, oh, I'm not a politician, but maybe you're on your way there. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe you're on your way to a place of authority and power. And if you have not properly examined your faithfulness now, the condition of your heart, right now at this point, when you're not being faithful with the power that you have right now, do not expect to be faithful with the power you have when you get there. Especially for the young people here. You are probably going to start off with a new job, you're going to be promoted, and it's going to keep going. But the question you must ask yourself is that, how are you supposed to conduct yourself at that position that we see of those that are described who are in power in this text? Yeah. We need to see as Christians that God's authority matters what kind of employment we choose, what kind of work you do, and whether you worship God with your hymns on Sunday, and you also do so with your work on Monday. When you work, like I said, you will be promoted and perhaps drawn into this rat race of power, as we will see many of the characters we see in this story. But if you're not careful in observing the condition of our heart and what God calls us to, we will pursue such powers of the world and of course leave godliness. So the title of my sermon this morning is The Predicament of Worldly Power. The predicament of worldly power. What we've just read, or what I've just read to you, is what happens, what is the kind of trouble that worldly power gets you into? What are the kind of issues when you obsess over this power of the world, or the power in which all of the world is searching for? What kind of troubles do you bring yourself into? The first one is this, taken from verses 1 through 3, and that is, worldly power is destructive. Worldly power is destructive. Verse 1, it says, "Now 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning to ambush to kill him on the way." See, verse 1 tells us immediately, upon replacing Felix, as we talked about in chapter 24, that this new governor comes into play, Festus, but he isn't any different. He also decides to appeal to the Jews and speak to the Jews immediately. 3 days into his reign, he goes and he speaks to the Jews. But the interesting thing here is that we see that these Jews haven't actually gotten over Paul. These Jews are just as angry as they were 2 years ago. It's almost like to think that they didn't have anything better to do. And they have not moved in their hatred against Paul, but it's still planning the same plot they did 2 years ago, which is essentially to kill Paul. And so we see here that these Jewish authorities, these Jewish people of power, in other words, are a symbol of power in religion also. And therefore they set as a reminder to us that even in the places that are supposed to be focusing on the worship of God, they are not free from the temptation of the power of the world. They're not free from the temptation of abusing the power of authority that has essentially been given them to administer and use properly for God's glory. See, the destructive nature of power is especially revealed in this case. And in this case, which is a case where that power could possibly be displaced. In other words, these Jews are worried, of course, because Paul is talking about a gospel that, of course, tells them that the head of the church, the leader of the church is not man, but of course Christ Jesus. And we've seen this all too many times when truth exposes the hypocrisy and failures of leadership, that eventually this truth, or in the case of Paul, becomes a target for those in power. And so we see here that the intention is it's not so much because Paul went into the temple or brought a Gentile, which is of course a lie, or these other things to which they accuse him of, but it's ultimately driven with the intention of course, preserving and protecting the power of the world that you've attained for yourself. And so we see here that these people want to destroy Paul. But it's not just the blatant destructive power. Destructive nature of power that we must be concerned with, but also the subtle nature of this corrupting power. We see here they don't want to kill Paul openly and publicly, but instead they want to kill Paul on the way to what they believe is going to be what Paul will somewhat believe if he went on that trip. An opportunity for, of course, for justice. They've done it many times. It's not the power, the destructive nature of this power is not one that attempts to operate in the light, but of course in the darkness. And they don't want to openly kill Paul, but like I said, they want to kill him on the way to a trial. And the reason why I'm talking not just about the destructive nature of it, but also the type, the subtle nature of this kind of destructive power, is because when we sin, we like to hide it. And similarly, so we find here we should not look at this text and think to ourselves like, that's not me. That might not be me. I'm not that kind of person. But if you are not careful, like I said, to consider the content and the condition of your heart when it comes to power, you'd be surprised that maybe 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, you'll find yourself in a much similar position as you see these Jews. Fallen man loves power, and it's something that stems ultimately from the inside. Something that is subtle, something that is hidden. And as we were talking about also at our women's Bible study yesterday, Matthew 15:19, it says, "For out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander." All of these things stem, of course, from a condition of sinfulness that resides in the heart of these people. I remember, I think it was John MacArthur, or it was John Piper, when we've seen many people, even with many people who are pastors and leaders within the church, when they have fallen and stumbled into sexual immorality and all kinds of sin, we need to consider, he had mentioned something along the lines that fall was not his only fall, but it starts off with small falls over and over again until it becomes visible to us. And so we must keep in mind that we must keep these things in check. Furthermore, we must not just keep in mind that the power of the world is destructive, and at the same time the power of the world is subtle, and we must keep close watch of it. But we also must keep in mind that the power of the world, is the destructive nature of the power of the world, is something that is not just hurtful to others, it's hurtful to ourselves. Galatians chapter 5 verses 13 to 15, the word of God says, "For you are called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another." You see, for us as Christians, like I said, this first 3 verses tells us once again about the dangers of such temptations of power within the church. You see, if Christians were free from the temptation of sin, then such warnings as we read about in Galatians chapter 5 is something that we shouldn't even be worried about. But we see here that God puts this in Scripture to remind us once again that while we have been set free with Christ, by Christ, we must be careful and be watchful of our conduct, because we still face temptation. However, it teaches us, as we see in this case, it says that we are to love others as we love ourselves, meaning on the other hand that if we destroy others, we are essentially destroying ourselves. And so this comes back to the principle that I'm drawing on, that no one's ever committed a sin that not only hurt other people, but of course has been detrimental to their own soul. In other words, we must not think that being destructive to others has no effect on us. But we see in the text that sinfulness, if it's indulged in, not only destroys others, but destroys ourselves. As Lord Acton, I think he was credited for this particular quote. It says, he said, "Power tends to corrupt, but absolute power corrupts absolutely." It's a famous quote that has been used many times, but it's conveying the fact that, especially as we've seen in politics, we know this all too well, that many people who aspire to such positions of authority, of power, have a tendency to start being corrupted with regards to ethics, morality, and even conduct. We see in the text that the Jews, in their hatred of Paul, which is being repeated over and over again, it has not quelled, but instead grown stronger. Yeah? And the intention to kill is growing, as we see in this case with regards to Paul. And so we must keep in mind that this love of power is destructive to a point where it doesn't stop growing, but it continues to fester into something that is truly dangerous. Yeah? Not just to others, but to themselves. We see in verse 15 of Galatians chapter 5, verses 13 to 15, that it says, "But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you're not consumed by one another." What we see here, interesting, that he uses the word devour. Yeah? It doesn't say use the word eat. Devour is, I would say, a more broader term. But the point being that devour doesn't convey control. It conveys expediency. It conveys greed. It conveys a sort of like an addiction. And so we see that no one ever who has indulged in sin ever stops sinning. Indulging more in sin doesn't make you stop sinning, but instead encourages an appetite that continues to grow. And as it says here, what would happen is that you would devour other people. We see much of in the world that is seeking after this worldly kind of power, that essentially, that searching for such things don't bring blessings, but in fact bring curses. Yeah. But we must keep in mind the context to which Galatians chapter 5 comes in. Yeah. And the context is kind of conveyed to us in verse 1 of chapter 5, where it says this: "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery." In other words, the reason why I'm bringing this verse into play is that we must move on to the second point, which is this: that Christ has indeed set us free. And therefore, to turn away from Christ is to submit again to a yoke of slavery. And the second point is this: worldly power is not freedom. Worldly power is not freedom. It says here in verse 4, Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea, and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So he said, "Let the men of authority among you go down with me, and if there's anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him after he has stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days." He went down to Caesarea, and the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. Like I said, at the end of chapter 24, we saw that Felix wanted to please the Jews, so he kept Paul in prison. But we saw in verse 22 of chapter 4 that he says the following words: "But Felix, having rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, 'When Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case.'" In other words, Felix, what he does is that instead of enacting justice immediately, he employs something that the Romans call omplius, whereby what they do is that instead of enacting a final judgment, what they would do, they would delay that final judgment. In other words, Felix didn't want to immediately come to a judgment with regards to Paul, but instead chose to hold it off. Because he knew that the judgment was what? That Paul was innocent. But why this point is so significant is because we see this all the time in our day and age. We see this all the time. There's a saying that justice delayed is justice denied. And the point of mentioning is that we see even with politicians today, often also in the case of Festus, rather than enacting justice immediately, have chosen instead to use Paul as a political pawn. In other words, you find, of course, when you read the news, it's like you see so many lawsuits but no convictions. You see so many people going to court, being tried for so many things, but of course no judgment is in fact being passed. And the question you must ask yourself is that why isn't judgment being passed? Well, for the same reason as we see in this case, because Festus knows that if he passes judgment on Paul, that he is innocent, the Jews will not like it. And so instead, just like Festus and just like Felix, what they do instead is to prolong or make it look like that justice is being carried out, or justice will be imminently carried out, but in fact it never does. Yeah. Yeah. See, the Jews' request in this case isn't just a suggestion to Festus on what they should do with Paul. It's actually a threat to Festus. Festus, like I said, he's the governor now, and he's thinking, he comes to these Jews in order to appease them, because that's how the previous guy lost his job. Yeah? And I don't want to lose my job too. So instead, what I'll do is that I'll talk to these people and come to some kind of resolution about what to do with Paul. Yeah? But of course, he knows that Paul is innocent. Yeah? So instead, he sees this thing, that these words that are said to him from the Jews, not as a suggestion, like I said, but as a threat. Yeah. And so in order to avoid this, what he does is they say, I'm going down to Caesarea. Why don't you bring some of your leaders with me, and we go down there and we try Paul's case there. Yeah. Yeah. But of course, we've seen, like I said, multiple times in this story so far, that Paul has been tried before the tribune, tried before the commander, tried before Felix, tried before Festus, and over again he's found innocent. But now what they're doing is they're just passing the buck around until eventually they figure out what's going on, until someone makes a judgment. Verse 7, it says, when he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him, but they could not prove, once again, that Paul was guilty. Verse 8, Paul argued in his defense, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. And once again, they could not prove that Paul was guilty. But at this point, Festus should have known it well enough. But you see, justice is a price too much to pay for the sake of this power. And this is why I said the title of this second point is that the worldly power doesn't bring freedom. Yeah. It doesn't. We see this man, this governor, is now running around almost like a lapdog for these Jews, trying to please every single person in order to preserve the power to which has been given him. And we do not see in this case a sign of someone that is powerful, someone that is really free, but a sign of somebody that is caged and in prison. But you see, justice, like I said, is a price too much to pay for the sake of this power. This could have been easily settled if Festus just understood Paul is innocent, carry out the justice. But because he wants to preserve and hold on to this power, he's now playing these games. Proverbs 11:1, it says, a false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. To better understand this passage in that particular time, they didn't have, they weren't working particularly when Proverbs 11:1 was written at that time. There wasn't sort of like the National Stock Exchange or proper record with regards to currency and so forth. But instead, what they used to do was that when it came into the marketplace, when it came to trading and so forth, they used to use scales. And the person that was buying this material, the tradesman at the marketplace, what he'd do is that he'd bring out a scale, and on that scale he'd write on a weight, like let's say 2 kg, 3 kg, and he'd put it on the scale. So when farmers used to bring their grain, they used to pour it onto the scale, and when he would reach 3 kg or so forth, then they would settle on a price. But Proverbs 11:1 is talking about sometimes these market people, what they would do is that they would put a weight on the scale and see it was 3 kg, but it was like 10 kg instead. And so what happens when people were pouring it onto the scale, pouring their flour or pouring their produce onto the scale, what they thought was 3 kg because the label was there was in fact not. And this was a sign, once again, where equal measures aren't being used in this case. And so when it comes back to our story, we see in the same way, when it comes to carrying out justice, when they know clearly that Paul is wrong, Paul is innocent, rather than come to that verdict, this person of power has realized this. That's not enough. Because why? The justice means I'll lose my job. The justice means that I will lose my position, I will lose my fame, I will lose my popularity. And we see in this case that what happens is that the justice of God, faithfulness, becomes even a price too high to pay for this person of power. And this is why it's so significant for us to understand that when you pursue and you hold on to this power, this worldly power, it doesn't mean freedom. It means bondage. And that's why I mentioned Galatians chapter 5, because he said, Christ has set you free. And what that means is Christ has set you free to a point that when it comes to something that is just, you will do it. When it comes to something that is good, you will do it. But he said, if you don't do that, you will subject yourself once again to this yoke of slavery. Now by a yoke of slavery such that now we see this person of power who has a title of governor, who has all the authority, but now he's listening to these sinful Jews. And so we must be careful when it comes to our conduct. If we love this worldly power, it's not going to set us free. It puts us in the very same dilemma, the very same debacle that we see here with regards to Festus. And we see, unfortunately, Festus has overloaded his side of the scale such that the word of God, the truth of the law, is something that is too light for his judgment to be faithful. So now you understand why in a country there's more trials than convictions. Now you understand in the country why we're paying all these taxes, but of course nothing is going on. Now you understand when you bring all these petitions and now we have all these people talking on social media and in government, nothing actually gets done. Because faithfulness and justice is not enough to tip the scale. Because it makes those in power seem like they're doing something when in fact they're not. But for the Christian, this is not justice when they delay doing the right thing. As James 4:17 says, if you know the right thing to do and you don't do it, that's sin. Simple as that. But we must keep in mind, in light of what Proverbs 11 says, that such failure to be just and be faithful is an abomination to the Lord. Like I said, we see here, this is in freedom, this is prison. Those in power aren't really free. They are bound by their love of power, their love of money, their love of favor, their love of accolades. And you find with whom power has, with whom those who have this kind of power, that this power is in fact become an idol. And they will abandon justice, unfortunately, as we see here in the case of Paul. And when you read Micah chapter 6, for instance, it talks about what does God require. In Micah chapter 6, verse 6, the word of God says this: with what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with 1,000 rams, with 10,000 of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the first fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? I like that verses 6 and 7, it kind of talks about a shopping list. Rams, oils, goats, whatever it may be. Will these things please the Lord? And you find one thing, people in power can afford all of those things. People in power can buy all those things. And you find in many instances when you watch those movies, with those mafia movies whereby you see, of course, these people coming, they're committing so much crime and they come to the church and they give thousands of dollars to the church and the priest just somehow forgives them and so forth, and they continue their life of debauchery and sin. We see in this case that people in the power can afford all those sorts of things. But look at verse 8. Verse 8 says this: God has told you, O man, what is good? And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and to love kindness and walk humbly with the Lord. See, the rich man can do any of those two things we see in verses 6 and 7. But verse 8, that's hard. But that is what God requires. Justice. But in the case of our story, they can't do this. And so the application for us is that we may not be politicians, but we are all tempted towards such power. We talk about many people aspiring for such careers, such positions of authority, but we must keep in mind what we see here in the text. And at the same time, even in today, I've talked to many people, even within the Christian circles, even within our church, when I see people who dedicate their time and effort and do so well at the expense of their church, at the expense of loving and caring for their wives and children. When men and women marry the world and succumb to the temptations and at the expense of walking humbly and worshiping Christ, I don't see a person that's free. I see a person that's in prison. I see a person that is caged. I see a person that is tied down by the world. And you can't hide it. Because that's the reality of what we see in this case. Because pursuing such things of the world at the expense of what God calls us to do, which is to be just, which is to be godly, which is to be faithful, it's because you're tied down by the world. You've submitted yourself to the yoke of slavery, as we see in the case of Galatians chapter 5. When someone cannot make time to prioritize the worship of God and faithfulness towards Him, it's because that person is not free, that someone is bound. And that's why we said many times in the church that the word busy, in other words, can be buried under Satan's yoke. Because why? Faithfulness to God is not able to tip the scale of commitment to godliness. Point 3, Christian freedom is powerful. Christian freedom is powerful. It says in verse 9, and this is from verses 9 through 12, but verse 9 it says this: "But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, 'Do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me?' But Paul said, 'I am standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried.'" See, this is important. While all these people are playing their political games, Paul knows who he is. He knows what is just. He knows what is right. He doesn't have to play their silly games, but he's remaining just in his actions and his conduct. He's demonstrating what it means to be a Christian when the whole world is compromising. He knows his rights, and he can request a hearing with Caesar, but pay close attention to his words here. It goes on to say, "To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well." He's telling what? He's telling Festus, you know this very well. Why are we going through this again? You know this. Verse 11, "If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death." In other words, we see here that, the problem with human beings is that we worry about opinions, positions, wealth, power. But Paul says, you worry about all those things. I don't even worry about death. And this is the problem that we have today. You see, this is important because if you commit, because that simple phrase, you commit the crime, do the time. Paul knows full well, if I've done something wrong, then charge me. But they know that he hasn't done anything wrong. But we see in this case that his position is even to a point that he could care less about all these things these people are clamoring for. And he couldn't even care less if he dies. But he knows full well who he is and what he must do. See, I'm reminded of that carnival game, the one where it's like this glass box with a hole and there's a gold bar inside. You put your hand inside and you try to get the gold bar out, And we see in this very similar case, these people, because their obsession with their gold bar, they will put their hand inside and stand there the whole day to try and pull it out when they cannot. And we see, like I said, in this particular situation, these people, all these people of authority, they've done the same thing. They've held on to their power so much that they haven't made themselves any freer. They've only imprisoned themselves to a lifetime of being a part of the carnival. And so in this case, we see here that Paul, on the other hand, because he doesn't hold on to such things, He has better things to do, such as the worship of God and faithfulness towards Him, that he is not drawn into nor distracted by such things. Yeah. And this is why for us, we need to pay careful attention, that we are not drawn into such same games. Because that's what it means to be powerful. You can't give him wealth, you can't give him money, you can't buy him, you can't threaten him with death. He will still remain faithful. Now it comes back to what we saw at the end of chapter 24, whereby what happened? At this point, although Paul had shared with him the gospel, shared Felix the gospel, what did Felix think? Man, I hope this guy will give me a bribe. Because that's what he's holding on to. He's holding on to his wealth. When in fact he's given the most priceless thing. And that is the gospel of Jesus Christ. May we never be like this. See, Paul, on the other hand, because he doesn't hold on to anything, in fact, he doesn't hold on to power, but instead holds on to weakness. He holds on to his weakness. His weakness at this particular point, the most weakest person that is standing here in this audience, being tried, being questioned, being threatened, being potentially in danger of being in danger of being killed. But we see here that Paul is holding on to weakness because it is in weakness where power is found. And how does he know this? Because Paul, he writes in his letter, that is what God told him. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verses 9 and 10, Paul writes the following, "But he said to me," in other words, God said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities, for when I am weak, I am strong." We see in this text that while the world is chasing after all of these powers, Paul is chasing for weakness, chasing to be so weak such that he's fully reliant on the power of God. And we're seeing what it does here, that now Paul, although being tried, is the most freest person in this room. And we must be like that. He goes on to say, but in verses 11 of Acts 25, "But if there's nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar." Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, "To Caesar you have appealed, and to Caesar you shall go." See, the interesting thing about this probably would have scared Festus. The reason being is because such a small case that could be easily tried, a justice could be swiftly given, but now he's going up to his boss, the emperor. And it gives him great concern. That's why you see in the next section, first it bothers Festus so much that now he's going to complain to the king of Judea, King Agrippa. Next point, worldly power is lost. Worldly power is lost. Verses 13 to 21, we'll go through this section. It says, "Now when some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. And as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, 'There is a man left prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accuser's face to face and had an opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. So when they came together, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought." We see here he's kind of repeating what has happened earlier in verses 1 through 12. He's recounting that story of verses 1 through 12 to King Agrippa. But Paul is now, but Festus is consulting this king, and his full name is King Herod Agrippa II. In other words, he's the great grandson of King Agrippa, King Herod Agrippa, who was the one that tried to get Jesus killed, was killing all the young kids when Jesus was born during that period. And so Agrippa, essentially, this king that we see here, he comes from a long line of sinful and worldly people. People so steeped in sin. And the Herodian dynasty was known for this, for its licentiousness, for its sinfulness. And we know this hasn't changed, because it says in the story that this King Agrippa showed up with Bernice. And if you know history, you can read it up online, that Bernice is actually King Agrippa's sister, who is taken as his own wife. And so you see in this case that he's steeped in sin. The lostness we can see here once again of worldly power we see in this case. As we said earlier, worldly power, it corrupts. It's not just damaging to other people, damaging to themselves. And so you see in this case that these people who are enacting this persecution on other people and hurting them with the power that they have only steeped themselves further and further into sin. But we see here the lostness of worldly power in the case of Festus, because now that he's faced with this particular problem, which he got himself into, he's now decided to go and consult someone that he thinks is probably going to give him better advice. And we should know, of course, that obviously in light of how sinful and how worldly this person is, he can't possibly help him any further. But you see, this is what happens to those who go and indulge and take on the world. We find, of course, many times, even those who come to church, who sing the hymns and sing the songs and open their Bibles at the same time, when faced with such adversity, rather than to turn to the power of Christ, have chosen, of course, to go and turn to their friends and those there in fellowship who are with them in the world. This is an example, once again, of the lostness we see here. We immediately know that this situation won't get any better, like I said, because of who Agrippa is. And so what we learn here is that we can tell, Christians can tell, when you love power, when we see the kind of people that you want to surround yourself with, the kind of connections that you want to make. And I've heard this many times by many people. Oh no, I'm friends with them because it probably, it's about connections, it's networking. And so what you essentially just confess to me is that connecting and being friends with the world is in fact more powerful than being faithful to Christ. But this is the example of the kind of lostness that we see pervade the church. Because why? People have not come to terms with the reality that you cannot be friends with the world and expect any blessings from indulging in the very same things that they indulge in. See, Paul, we see here, he stands with God. And the question we must ask ourselves is, who do you stand with? Who do you stand with under such circumstances? From a biblical lens, we've established that those who love the world aren't free. But now we see from that same lens that it teaches us that those who love such things are lost. But let's explore this even further. He explains to them what had happened. He goes on in verse 18. When the accusers stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I supposed. Well, it's already mentioned numerous times in our text and even in previous chapters that Paul is innocent. It feels as though that Luke is repeating these things over and over again. He's tried, Paul is innocent. He's tried, Paul is innocent. But I don't think that if he didn't mention this and repeated it over again, we'll understand the lostness of these people. We'll understand just how lost these people are, such that we're now doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting a different result. Which is often termed as, how do you define foolishness in this case? But we see here, once again, it conveys the blindness and the lostness of those. When people do not enact justice, we often see that these people are lost or blind. You probably watched a few rugby matches or sports event over the past few weeks, and you're probably like, when the referee doesn't give the right call, they say, "What are you blind?" So similarly, so in this instance, when a justice is not being enacted, when the right thing to do is very obvious and clear, the immediate assumption within everyone's mind is that these people are lost. And similarly so, when we are faced with adverse conditions, when we're faced with injustices, when we're faced with all these kind of problems, the simple option is to, of course, turn to Christ. Come to church. Be faithful. Plant yourself in ministry. Surround yourself with the people that are good. But then you sit there, just like we see in the case of Festus, and act ignorant of the reality of the blazing truth that stands before you. It goes on into verse 19. It says this: rather, they had certain points of disputes with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether they wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, will you hear him? See, the dispute was about their own religion. We've already covered that. But look at what specifically the dispute is about. It says about Jesus who died but was raised. In other words, we see here that the lostness particularly is not just lostness that manifests in the form of who they consult, who they surround themselves with, but more specifically lostness with regards to the gospel. Yeah. Everyone in this world who does not confess faith in Jesus Christ is lost, as we see in this case. Yeah. And the gospel is simply this, as we've covered many times, that all men have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, are deserving of his wrath and condemnation. Yeah. But God sent his Son Jesus Christ, who lived a perfect and sinless life, died on the cross, rose again, and anyone who confesses faith in Jesus Christ and recognizes him as Lord and Savior will be saved and be empowered by the Holy Spirit to see as Paul sees in this text. Yeah? But unless, of course, you've come to be reconciled to God, you'll be just as lost as this particular person. And how do we see that lostness manifest also in this case? Yeah. Because he says this, being at a loss on how to investigate such things. Really? The governor? The governor can't investigate these things? You're telling me the governor can't go and ask the two soldiers that were outside the tomb of Jesus about whether Jesus had rose again from the dead? You tell me the governor can't ask Thomas, hey Thomas, did you touch Jesus Christ after his resurrection? Touch his wounds? Or you can't ask Peter, hey Peter, did you meet Jesus? Or you can ask the 500 people that Paul writes about in 1 Corinthians 15 and ask them, did you guys see Jesus after he rose again from the dead? We see in this case an example of the kind of spiritual blindness and lostness of all those people in the world that we see today. The atheist who goes around, there's no such thing as God, when there's evidence everywhere with regards to the existence of God. There's evidence, even as the Bible, the number one selling book in the world, that speaks so clearly about who Jesus Christ is. And these people are somewhat, I'm at loss on how to investigate such things. This is not a case of a lack of evidence. This is a case of hardness of heart, a case of spiritual blindness and disobedience. And so we see here, with all his power, with all his money, with all his wealth, he apparently can't see the obvious. And so we see here that such power is so corrupting to the point that it makes you so blind to the reality of who Jesus Christ is. Ephesians chapter 4 verse 17, it says this, now this I testify in the Lord, that you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their minds. They are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God, because of the ignorance that is in them, due to their hardness of heart. They have become careless and have given themselves up to the sensuality, the greedy to practice every kind of impurity. But that is not the way you learned Christ. And so this is not just a warning about we must not be like such Gentiles as we've read in this story, but we must keep in mind that if we do not conduct ourselves in a way that recognizes the power of Christ, we will fall back and do the very same things that we see here. Every Christian, for that matter, who has confessed faith in Christ knows that certain sins are wrong. So I don't need to come and explain that to you. But you see, of course, when people feel so guilty, they think that they plead to such ignorance as though they know full well what they shouldn't do. Yeah. But they do it anyway. Yeah. And when you don't confess your sin, but choose instead to plead ignorance, like we see in the case of Festus, we've chosen, of course, to turn back to be like the world. And instead, not understand what Paul says here in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 20. But that is not the way that you learn Christ. This is why we speak the truth of the gospel to all people. Why? Because we see here, even in the case of Festus, he has all the evidence. His problem is not a lack of evidence. It's a lack of understanding and know who Christ is, according to the gospel. This is why we start with the gospel. This is why we share the gospel. Because as the Bible teaches us in Romans chapter 1, 1 Corinthians 1, that the gospel is the power of God for salvation. And for even people in authority and power, even the president, the prime minister, anyone who assumes political, they will not be just unless they, of course, know true justice that is to be found in Jesus Christ. Last point. Worldly power is overrated. Worldly power is overrated. Yeah. We see he's already given his account to this person, Agrippa. And it says, so on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, and they entered the audience with a hall of military tribunes and prominent men of the city. Then at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. And Festus said, King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man about whom the whole Jewish people petitioned me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had done nothing deserving of death. And as he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him. But I have nothing definite to write to my lord about him. Therefore I brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable in sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him. In other words, like I said, he's sending him to Caesar, but he has no charge to write. Yeah? So he's brought him before Agrippa so that perhaps Agrippa can find a reason to charge this man. Yeah? But you see that Paul lives so blamelessly that he has essentially no reason. There's no reason to charge him for any kind of crime. Yeah? And once again, Paul will make his case before this authority. Yeah? But when we read the text, we see that Luke, and this is why I say worldly power is overrated, because interestingly, Paul makes a specific note that these people, Agrippa and Bernice, come with great pomp. Yeah? And they surround themselves with all their fellow politicians and people of authority. In other words, to show their magnificence, show their prestige, dress up so well, and all these kinds of things, and all these kind of decorations. They aren't any different from what Christ says about the Pharisees, who like to dress themselves up and sit in all the high places. And we see this all too well, even in our society today, where people, in order to demonstrate power, they would rather demonstrate it in looks rather than, of course, action. Yeah. In other words, it was like a means to show off, a means to show prestige. Yeah. Yeah. But here we see, as my point suggests, that worldly power is overrated. And we should think of this passage. These people really think there's something, And similarly so, the reason why I'm emphasizing this point, because we have young people in the church. We have young men and women in the church. We have people who are now probably at the start of their career. Yeah? And are thinking to themselves, I want to be like that. I want to be like this. Yeah? And I'm telling you right now, it's overrated. Yeah? We see here, on the other hand, like Paul, we should neither be intimidated nor impressed by politicians. Yeah. We should not be impressed by people who, like the Pharisees, try to look and sit and be in all the nice places. Yeah. But really, as we've already covered, have no real power. They're just prisoners of their own idol. Yeah. And that is the posture that we have. Yeah. the posture that we should have as Christians, the same posture that Paul has, that we see here, that all the clothing and possessions can never hide the condition of a person's heart. No matter how much you decorate it, no matter how much possessions you have, you can never hide the conditions of your heart from the Lord. And we see here that the reason why that Paul is not impressed by these people of power is simply because God is not impressed by them either. And our problem is this: we want to make all these network connections, and we think, of course, that by doing such things and having these kind of relationships with the world will of course, be something that is God glorifying, when in fact, it's telling us that by being good, by being faithful, it needs to be mixed up with unfaithfulness in order to bring blessing. We see on the other hand that Paul will not soil his hands with those fancy things. And we must ask ourselves honestly, when we're pursuing whatever career, I'm not saying that, pursuing such career, working hard and so forth, doesn't result in elevation to positions of power. The point that I'm getting at is that if that's what you want, then you will miss out on the faithfulness that we see here in the case of Paul. What good is it, as we see in the case of Christ, when he says many times, what good is it if a man gain the whole world and lose his soul? And all we see here in this audience is, in the audience that we see here in this text, is that we see all these people with all these nice things, but all soulless, and lost and dead. And so we must see things through the lens of Christ. Furthermore, we should instead see here what truly needs to be acknowledged. Where the power is actually here in this text, in this place, in this setting that is set for us in the last 3 verses here. And that is this. In Luke 21 verse 10, we see here what is taking place in Acts is what Christ had spoken about in Luke. And remember, Luke wrote the book of Acts. So in other words, he's paralleling what Christ had said essentially with what is taking place in this moment. In Luke 21 verse 10, he said this: Christ said, "Then he said to them, nations will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes in various places, famines and pestilences, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. But before all this, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. This will be your opportunity to bear witness. Settle it, therefore, in your minds, not to meditate beforehand how to answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict." Do we see that here in this text? No matter what governor, no matter what king, they can't even find out one thing to catch Paul. And we see in this case a fulfillment of the power of God in this particular scenario. Verse 16, "You will be delivered up even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and some of you they will put you to death. You'll be hated by all for my name's sake. But not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your lives." We see here where the power is in this story in Acts 25. It's not with the kings, it's with Paul. And now we must understand now fully and be convicted in our minds that once again the power of the world is overrated. As we conclude, we've learned there's indeed no freedom in worldly power. There is no clarity in worldly power. There is no justice in worldly power. And if anything, we learn at this point that power is best left to God. And that's the problem, right? We clamor for this illusion of power when in fact we should recognize that ultimately the power is not with the politicians, it's not with the kings, it's not with the lords, it's not with the bosses, it's with Christ. It's with Christ. Power in the hands of God, as we see in this case, in the case of Paul, what is going on in Paul's life cannot be corrupted, and can never corrupt. We see today, as we read this text, that God is sanctifying our souls with the power of Christ. Sanctifying our souls in the same way that Paul is being sanctified in this case. Not to be dependent on the power of the world, but to be dependent on the power of Christ. And if you come away from this text, come away from this sermon, thinking to yourself, you know what, I need to go and please my boss after this. Yeah? Then you're in pursuit of the wrong kind of power. Yeah? We instead, as we see here, that once again, that the most freest person in the room is Paul. And that's the power of Christ to set us free. So we instead must pursue not the power of the world, but the power of Christ. And what is the power of Christ? Once again, coming back as we close to Galatians chapter 5, verse 13, it tells us, "For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." Like I said, and I've talked about last week, the Christian shouldn't be aiming for the power and the positions we see in the world. We should be aiming to serve and to love. And you know what's the ironic thing about that? That for us as Christians, our intention is to serve. And to serve other brothers and sisters in the power of Christ, with the freedom that Christ has given us. But we call politicians public servants. For us as Christians, we must be the best servants. For us as Christians, we must be the best servants. Because as we can see here today, Paul, in serving Christ, has served us today. Let's turn to the Lord in prayer.